On the 13th of June, he will perform with his para orchestra for the first time at the Holland Festival. The audience will be able to walk among the musicians. Wybrand Shop from the Cultural Press Agency asks him about the deeper reasons behind his love for the drone. This is the Culture Purse podcast. Your host is Wybrand Shop.
What? No.
Okay, cool. Here we go.
Mr. Charles Hazlewood, thank you for being with us in this very busy schedule that you have all over the world. I think you're touring. I would like to start with a question, which may be a bit well, it's on topic. What's the best way to enjoy music? And is it at home with earphones, with a £1 million sound system, in a concert hall, or in the street, or in the middle of the orchestra?
Well, there is a question. The answer is that all of those are brilliant, preeminent ways of enjoying music. I think depending on one's mood, depending on one's circumstance. But if I were given a choice, I would always argue that the most exquisite way to experience music is right in the middle of it. The Anatomy of the Orchestra project, which we're bringing, as you know, to Holland Festival, was born really out of an experience I had when I was just 6 years old. My mother took me to see an orchestra rehearse. Now, I'd never been near orchestras. I was already very into my music, but I was a choir boy. I sang in a choir. So choral music was my entry point. I'd never been near an orchestra. So suddenly I'm sitting all alone in a vast empty auditorium looking at a ginormous symphony orchestra rehearsing. And at some point, the conductor paused what he's doing with the orchestra and he turned around and he peered at me and he said, "You look awfully lonely down there. Why don't you come and sit amongst us whilst we rehearse?" So I somewhat shyly sort of staggered up and sat myself down somewhere near the viola section in the middle of the orchestra. And they began once again to resume rehearsing. And nothing prepared me for this kind of waterfall of glorious sound, of melodic, harmonic, rhythmic information piling into me or coalescing in thin air around my ears. My life was sort of changed in that moment. And I suppose ever since, I've been wanting to gift that kind of experience to an audience member. You see, invariably, we experience an orchestra from the outside looking in. You know, we are sitting in shade ranks in the stalls of an auditorium. Auditoriums are usually sort of shoebox shaped, and the orchestra is this kind of perfectly gift wrapped but rather distant thing in the far away. Now, that's all well and good. You hear this beautifully homogenized, beautifully mixed sound sort of flooding around your head. But how would it be if you climbed inside the machine as it operated? How would it be if you climb inside what I would call the perfect team? In fact, actually, if you look at the orchestra, often upwards of 100 people, it is the most perfect team that exists in human experience. There's no more evolved form of teamwork that exists. I mean, football has 11 players, right? An orchestra has often upwards of 100. So it's perfect synchronicity, and yet where there is almost infinite personal freedom for each individual musician in that orchestra to bring what is uniquely theirs to bear. It's a kind of completely unrivaled and unparalleled form of teamwork. So yeah, I'd say in the midst of it, so a long answer to your short question, in the midst is the best possible way.
Okay, thank you very much for this long answer. I was wondering also because you were talking about this highly individual musicians. I mean, the image we have of an orchestra is of a highly disciplined one person, one wall of sound coming to you, and people having to do everything in sync with everyone and listening to the director. How do you combine those things?
Well, the fact is, okay, here's a truth that I'm going to share with you. I could play, let's say, a Beethoven symphony in London on a Tuesday, and I could play that same symphony in Amsterdam on a Saturday, right? Now, say, just accept for a fact that I've stayed the same person. The Beethoven symphony is still the same. But if I'm doing my job properly, I will have two completely different experiences of that symphony between London and Amsterdam, because I'm talking about two different groups of people who've got different qualities, different strengths, different sort of portions of uniqueness, which each one of them brings to bear. You know, my job as conductor is to create an overall architecture, kind of a very safe and yet very fertile and free place, kind of overall structure or architecture within which there then should be almost infinite freedom for each musician to bring what is uniquely theirs to bear. So yes, it's true, there's discipline. Of course, there's discipline like an army platoon, but so much more freedom than you'd ever find in an army platoon.
Really, that's because well, I was coming to this issue because well, we have now some issue with one of our famous conductors who has been well criticized for being too much of a bully.
Oh, really? Oh dear, that's the old world, I'm afraid.
Yeah. What's your opinion on leadership in such a situation?
Okay, well, to me, leadership is definitely not about coercion. That's a kind of old patriarchal model of leadership, which I would hope is long dead and buried by now. And indeed, if this conductor has been a bully, then he should be put away in the long grass, quite honestly, he, she, they. No, leadership, okay, put another way, the greatest leader, in my opinion, is the greatest listener. And you can apply that in any form of the corporate world, in the teaching world, in the athletic world, in any world. Leadership is about listening. It's about creating a platform for other people to shine, right? Because we are greater than the sum of our parts. If I'm listening to what the oboe is doing, if I'm really listening to what the oboe is bringing me, then I can create a platform for that oboe player, which means that oboe player will fly higher than ever normally they do, right? So it's quite simple. Leadership is not about coercion.
Well, that's very, very clear. Now over to the para orchestra. You conceived the idea in 2011, I think, in
Yes,
for the Olympics.
correct.
What did it start as a one-off idea for one particular moment, or how did you see the future of this?
Well, yes. The backstory to Para Orchestra is that I'm very lucky. I've got 4 children, and my youngest beautiful child was born with cerebral palsy. So in her life, in her short life, she started me thinking about that whole community of people that I'd never considered before. In other words, that vast community of people who identify as disabled. I don't know about in Holland, but in the UK, 20% of the population identify as disabled. So it's an enormous minority, right? So I started thinking, why is it that in over 3 decades of that time of conducting orchestras all over the world, why is it that I virtually never find any musician in any orchestra who has a disability? So I'm thinking, well, this is odd. It's not like there's a sign on the door of any orchestra which says, if you're disabled, you aren't welcome here. The problems are much more grassroots and fundamental. For instance, in the UK, there are still an overwhelmingly large number of concert halls with a stage you can't get on if you use a wheelchair. So that's quite a fundamental problem. Plus, a lot of musicians with disability use assistive technology to make music. They don't play a conventional instrument. Now, again, in the UK, but certainly I think true throughout the world, there are very few skilled teachers of assistive technology in our schools, in our music schools, in our conservatoires. So there's no one at kind of conservatoire level to teach this stuff. That's another fundamental barrier. Plus the fact, even more sort of like deep grain, deep and fundamental, is the problem that most people in the world, and I'm sorry to say this, most people in the world still find it quite hard to put the words disability and excellence in the same sentence. Now, we've had the Paralympic movement, which in no small way was an inspiration to me for starting Para Orchestra. But let's be under no illusions there. You know, Paralympics has taken at least 50 years to come to a place where people trust it as being anything more than just a kind of fuzzy sort of like, oh, let's get some poor wannabe disabled athletes and give them a chance. Bless them, didn't they do well? People don't watch Paralympics for that anymore. They watch it because it's world-class sport. Now, I was thinking all these thoughts, 2011, if you may remember, Paralympics came to London in 2012. So I'm thinking, well, here is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when the eyes of the entire world community is on my community to shine a light on this problem, not just in order to say, come on, guys, let's level the playing field, but more than that, much more philosophically and fundamentally to say, why would you miss out on talent because a certain person doesn't fit a standard mold? That makes no sense. So again, back to that 20% of the UK population, I'm thinking that's an enormous number to either overlook or indeed to undervalue. So the orchestra was born to play at one of the ceremonies around the 2012 Paralympics. And indeed, it did make its first performance at the closing ceremony of the 2012 Paralympic Games. At that point, it was purely an ensemble of musicians with disability, really world-class professional musicians with disability. Obviously, the long game and where we are now was to create an orchestra which is a beautifully evolved mixture of people with and without disability. I wasn't and remain completely uninterested in creating another ghetto for disabled musicians. This isn't a place where just disabled musicians go. This is a place where everyone goes, because everyone has something to gain from being alongside everyone else. You know, people tend to think of disability, the whole disability issue, as a one-way street, one direction of travel, that disabled people will do everything they can to join the non-disabled world, because largely our world is a non-disabled world. Well, that is to fundamentally overlook the fact that actually non-disabled people have an enormous amount to learn from being around people who have disabilities. I'll give you an example. When I started sort of like looking for musicians for Power Orchestra, again, 2011, 2012, I found something really remarkable. So here's the thing. When you sit down to improvise with people, and this is something I've been doing all of my career, I mean, all my life, actually. I love, wherever I'm in the world, to sit down with a bunch of people probably I don't know, to jam, right? We sit down and have a jam, something I like to do. Now, there is always one scenario which prevails here, which is you sit down to make music, you don't know how it's going to pan out, you're all sort of like waiting, ready to go. Then there's a terrible long silence, because no one wants to put their hat in the ring first. Everyone's a bit insecure. People are concerned they might look a bit foolish, so they sit back waiting for someone else to make the first call. Now, this silence goes on and on and on and on, right? Until such point as kind of all the oxygen has been sucked out of the room. People are kind of like starting to get a bit mad, and then everyone dives in, and it's a great big bloody mess. It takes ages for people to relax, to start to trust themselves, trust the people around them, to start eventually making something resembling, you know, congruent music. Now, with the first 4 disabled musicians in Power Orchestra, I would say that whole process took 20 seconds.
Really?
Because I think if you use a wheelchair, if you have a vision impairment, the great fringe benefit to that is you don't sweat the small stuff. Okay, you're not worrying, does my bum look big in these trousers? You're interested in more deep and fundamental things. You know, there's a courage that goes with it. There's a curiosity that goes with it. So they were just diving in like minnows in a stream. Look at that. Oh, yeah, I like that. I'm going to go with this. You know, so there's a freedom and a liberation that comes with being, as I've just discovered, around musicians with disability, which, my goodness, the London Symphony Orchestra need to learn about that.
Yeah.
They do. They do.
Because you've worked a lot with symphony orchestras, and
Yeah.
also there is a very well, we've talked about the discipline things, and but also there's a very well way in which they should look, which the instruments should be original and close to the way they was written for in 70.
Yes.
And then you come with specially adapted instruments or even new created instruments. How does this combine into this symphonic tradition?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm not really talking about the tradition. I'm not for a minute suggesting that one should reframe Brahms in the context of digital instruments, although that could be an interesting project in and of itself. I'm talking about the orchestra as an ongoing, modern and forward-looking tradition. You know, we get stuck when we think that orchestras are simply and only custodians of a tradition. That's not all they are. It's a fundamentally important part of what they are, but not all they are. I'm not for a minute suggesting, as I say, that one should reframe Mozart in the basis of a newly configured group of instruments, although, as I say, that can be interesting. You know, so for the traditionalist out there, for the person who loves their Poulenc done a certain way, that shouldn't change. But that doesn't mean for a minute that an orchestra can't start to hire ranks of analog synthesizers, assistive technology, digital instruments to form part of their overall tonal spectrum. Why shouldn't they? The orchestra is the most kind of like beautifully broad tonal spectrum that exists in music. There's no reason why it can't continue to grow. You know, as I say, orchestras are custodians of tradition, but they are also the most evolved team in human experience. Now, that is not old-fashioned. That is as modern as humankind continues to be permanently modern.
Yeah. So, are you still? I mean, are there still instruments being developed for people with disabilities? And how do you? Is it also something which you have stimulated? Is it because of you that this thing is happening?
Well, look, I'm not going to make any bold or arrogant claims that we've completely changed the kind of the world view. Although I would suggest that perhaps, you know, there is globally a greater awareness of disability and a greater, you know, more sophisticated kind of thinking going into how we can create a more sort of evolved mixture of people in our modern world and platforms for everyone. Yes, it's changing, but it's slow, you know, it's very slow. I know that in my lifetime, all orchestras in the world aren't going to become beautifully evolved mixture of non-disabled and disabled. They aren't, because the world is has a very slow pace of change. But I'd like to think that we are shining a light on the issue and proving the point to people that you can put disability and excellence absolutely in the same sentence. Yes, new assistive technology instruments are being invented all the time, depending on the particular needs, the strengths and the weaknesses of a particular musician. That will go on and on and on. And thank goodness that human beings are sophisticated enough to be able to carry on developing such ideas. The world is an ever evolving place, and that's wonderful.
Yeah. Because well, there's this prejudice among us, abled people, people without visible disabilities, that well, to be a professional musician, you have to have all these abilities. And how can you become a professional musician if you can't use your hand or things like that? I mean, you have this really urge to have professional musicians with disabilities. How is this? How does this go on the music schools, on the conservatoire and things?
Well, this is where they've got to adjust their thinking, and they've got to start hiring, teaching staff who've got the sophistication and the knowledge and the experience of assistive technology. It's not to do with whether you do or don't have hands. It's to do with whether you can play great music.
Yeah.
By whatever means are necessary. I'll give you an example. One of our principal clarinets in the orchestra is he plays more in tune than any clarinetist I've encountered in any orchestra anywhere in the world. Now, this clarinetist has profound deafness. So you ask yourself, well, how the hell is he playing so in tune? The answer is he's reading the intonation through the vibrations in his fingertips.
Really?
At which point you realize, well, you don't really need ears, do you? You don't need ears, you got your fingers, right? So there is invariably, human beings are very good at finding ways around problems, finding ways around shortcomings. And he's indeed made an absolute virtue out of his so-called shortcoming.
Yeah, but how did you come about someone like that? I mean, this is
well, I've always got my ears open and my eyes open. I think he was someone I discovered via the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. So he was already, flying very high, quite rightly, because he's astonishing. He's now in his 30s. He's been with us for about 12 years. And we're so grateful to have him.
Yeah. And are there other, instruments which you didn't think possible for?
Yeah, I mean, it's every time a new piece of assisted tech comes along, I go, wow, that's something I hadn't thought of. But then, I don't have the skill sets, I don't have the imagination. I mean, I'm not an instrument maker, and I'm not, someone who works in technology. That stuff is like a kind of weird science to me. I'm a musician, so I'm not really very interested in the wheres and wherefores and how a piece of tech was put together. I'm interested in what it can do, and at that point, you've got all my attention.
Yeah, because well, you're now in Amsterdam, coming with a concert with a lot of different compositions. I think. How do you choose the work? And also, well, there's a lot of questions I have about it. And
yeah, well, first of all, to say that's a show which is all about the deep power of drone. Now, drone is funny. I mentioned earlier about being 6 and being taken to see the orchestra play, and that being a kind of like life-changing moment. Well, drones for me were like an absolutely essential comfort blanket when I was small. I had, unfortunately, a very traumatic childhood, and I got sent away to boarding school when I was 11, and I was, not in a good way. I was kind of suicidal, and friendless, and alienated, just very unhappy small child. And drone was something which was like so important to me, because if you think about drone music, you've got this fixed point, this fixed tone that will not give up whatever happens, and the melody and the harmony is kind of like pulling away from it, chafing against it. So that creates drama, right, which is part of what makes it interesting. But it always has to return to the drone, because the drone will not yield. So the drone is like the ultimate security. It's like a fundamental, which I didn't have. I was lacking in a root. I was kind of untethered. So to kind of have a music which felt so secure was deeply, deeply comforting to me. So I suppose drone music has always had a special resonance for me, and I often come back to it. And this is a show all about that, really, the simple and kind of life-giving power of the drone.
Really, that's impressive. I've never thought of it that way. I mean,
Okay.
that's very, very
Yeah.
interesting. And then also, I think this is then in a combination with drone and people being able to walk among the musicians.
Yes.
So it's all going back to this moment when you were 6.
Well, yeah, I mean, so often our childhood experiences inform everything, don't they? And if we're lucky, we can find ways of revisiting them. Yeah, and I'm lucky. I have an orchestra, and I can program music and experiences which are resonant for me. And of course, I do that in the hope that they'll be resonant for others.
Yeah. So para orchestra, is this now your only work you do, or are you
Yes,
still
correct.
conducting?
Absolutely. Isn't that, aren't I lucky? I basically, I had well, for many of us, I'm sure, when lockdown happened, that was a very strange moment in time for everyone on the planet. Now, for me, it was strange, but it was also kind of a moment of wonder. I found myself sitting in my studio day after day. Now, this was unparalleled because I had spent the previous 30 years airport hopping. I was just on tour all the time. So I'm suddenly sitting in my studio day after day and kind of like in wonder at this peace and this stillness. And by then, of course, Power Orchestra had really started to take off. I thought to myself suddenly, do you know what? I don't want to tour with all these other orchestras anymore. Because I've got this orchestra, which is so much more hungry for change, which is so much more hungry to kind of shift every paradigm, to find different ways of working. A power orchestra, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, has a courage about it, has a curiosity about it. This is a bunch of musicians who are just wide open for every new experience. They're not stuck on an old model. A lot of orchestras, unfortunately, are a bit stuck in a tradition. They're a little bit institutionalized, perhaps a little bit infantilized. Just want to carry on doing what they've always done, the way they've always done it, which is very human, right? I've got an orchestra that's not like that. So I'm thinking, I'm actually now going to just quietly say goodbye and thank you very much to the orchestras that I have been working with, and indeed the agent I had. So I just wrote a lot of goodbye letters.
Really?
And from then on, Power Orchestra's been my only band, and I am happiest I've ever been in my life.
Really?
Mm.
That sounds good. There's a very good influence from the pandemic.
Yes, I would say I did very well out of it. So I'm a happy 50-year-old, you know.
Yeah. So so you don't miss doing your Bruckner.
Well, I mean, don't count it out. I may well play Bruckner with Power Orchestra. I mean, Power Orchestra plays Mozart, plays Beethoven, you know,
Yeah.
just as much as it plays John Cage and I know Lamont Young. So the world of music remains completely open to me. I'm just not playing it with those other orchestras anymore.
Yeah.
Which is just the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So this I think you're making the orchestra world, at least in this place, more dynamic.
Thank you.
Is it also, do you offer opportunities for other orchestras to become more open, more diverse, more inclusive also?
Okay, so thank you for asking that question. I think when we formed Power Orchestra and kind of in the years that have gone by since, we've always had a clear choice. We could either spend a lot of our energy sort of standing on the parapet, shouting at the industry to change, throwing darts, come on, get on, just being like a kind of like a sort of agitprop. We could either do that, or we could do what we are doing, which is we are being the change we want to see, which I think is a much better way of spending one's time. I think I'd be dead by now if I was caught up with how the industry is not catching up, because the pace of change, as I said earlier, is glacial. It's incredibly slow. Not in my lifetime is much going to change, right? So I'd rather be the change I want to see. So that's simply what we do at Power Orchestra. And indeed, we are seeing signs that other institutions are starting to kind of like read from the same book. But like I say, it's very slow. So I almost don't want to know what's going on out there. I just want to be the change I want to see.
Well, it's a very optimistic.
Listen, it's partly about sort of self-care. It's like I said, I think I would unravel like politicians invariably unravel because the world doesn't change in the way you hope it will. It's so slow. And there's a lot of backward steps, 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back, la, 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 so I almost don't want to know because it's too depressing.
Yeah, because right now the movement from all kinds of dictatorships, even in the US, is going in direction of anti-DEI.
So depressing. It's so depressing. I can't think how the humankind is so kind of like they forget so quickly about what happened just before, and they go back there again, and then they go back there again, and they think, oh, I'm doing this because it's going to make life better for me. It never does. Yeah, it depresses me more. Like I say, I almost can't bear to read the news. I just want to sort of cut myself off because what can I do? And if I read it, it just makes me, well, it's sort of like neutral. It neuters me. It makes me kind of paralyzed because I think, well, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. So again, I cut myself off and I just quietly be the change I want to see. That's all I can do.
Well, that's a very good word, I think, for and offer people the same drone experience you had.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I hope people will come along and taste the drone because, my goodness, it's a good flavor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hazlewood, Charles Hazlewood. I think people will look forward to your concert in Amsterdam. I am looking forward, surely. Well, and I thank you very much for this brief chat we had. And
it's been really, really nice to talk to you. Thank you so much for dialing me up.
Yeah.
Wist je dat al meer dan 400 professionals en kunstliefhebbers lid zijn van Cultuurpers? Word ook lid via nieuwsbrief.cultuurpers.nl en geef je support aan onafhankelijke journalisten met een hart voor de kunst.